Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast. Trent and Leighton Kling with you today. Coming up, we'll talk about Under Armour once again seeing their North American revenue decline. We'll talk about CVS doing something only for the second quarter in the last 5 years. And we've got a special interview today with the founders of the Barefoot wine brand. They're going to talk about the dynamics of getting products in stores and distribution dynamics when you vertically integrate as a company. They've got a lot of great stuff to say. Make sure you hang around for that. But we lead off today's show with shares of lumber liquidators falling over 16% on Tuesday, due in large part to an earnings miss. However, there are positives here to glean from the flooring retailer. Now, their fiscal calendar mirrors the standard yearly calendar, as does CVS, we'll talk about later. These first quarter results were for the period ending March 31st. And Leighton, while the market was a little bit bearish coming out of this earnings call, there are some positives to pick up out of it.
Absolutely. And for full disclosure, I am a Lumber Liquidators shareholder still. I bought in around $30 a share a long time ago, several years ago now, right after the formaldehyde incident and that subsequent 60-minute special. Because of that, shares had obviously tanked and ended up going down to around $11, $12 a share here recently, but have been on the upswing, actually north of around $40 per share. And I'll explain why as we discuss this latest earnings call as to why I probably should have sold when they hit that mark. But those earnings per share figures, Trent, were expected to be in the negative territory, but their loss of 4 cents per share was actually a little bit wider than the consensus estimates of around 3 cents per share loss. Net loss for the company was $2 million or 7 cents per diluted share, compared to a net loss of $26.4 million a year earlier, or 93 cents per diluted share if you want to look at the earnings per share marks. Last year, their margins, and as we'll get into, were worse, as well as their legal fees that they had been incurring. Happy news existed in pretty much every way outside of said profits, though, as net sales for the first quarter of 2018 increased $13.4 million, or around 5.5% to $261 million from around $248 million this time last year. Same-store sales jumped a modest 2.9%, driven by a 4.7% increase in the average sale, partially offset, and this is a little bit worrisome for the company, by a decline in traffic. 1.8% fewer customers came into their stores to actually buy something. Poor weather could have been a problem for this traffic comp. We will look and see if these numbers end up rising in the second and third quarter. They opened 5 net new stores during the first quarter of 2018, bringing total store count to around 398 at the end of March. Their growth has been steady, but slow in recent years due to all of the expenses, having to pay a lot of lawyers, a lot of legal fees, due to other lawsuits, not just the big EPA lawsuits that have been coming out. But to put this in perspective, they had just over 350 stores at the end of 2014. We have to remember that this was when they were considered a big growth story, a big growth company not that long ago. So when they had 350 stores, a lot of people were saying they had a runway for 800, 900 stores throughout the United States. We see now that they've only opened 48 stores since the end of 2014. And as we dig into the details, I mentioned the gross margin. Gross margin is increasing, but is not still up to the pre-contamination scare levels, now around 36.3% of sales from around 34.9% in the first quarter of 2017. And let's remember those gross margin figures before the 60-minute special. They were around 39 to 40% gross margin in the 2014 timeframe, when the stock, by the way, was skyrocketing. The company credits this most recent gain to a higher mix of what they call manufactured products, specifically engineered vinyl plank, that carries higher gross margins than some of the company's other product categories. This is something we had talked about last quarter during Lumber Liquidators' fourth quarter earnings call, and that they were really bullish on this vinyl plank. A lot of contractors are falling in love with this material. The vinyl plank has been extremely popular for those contractors doing flips, but also those replacing their carpet in their basements, not wanting to pay those expensive carpet prices, and it's a little bit easier to install. So a win-win for both segments of their customer population. We see that transportation costs have been going up as they cited rising fuel prices, Trent. We did our own little bit of research here, and the EIA puts out monthly fuel cost data, and there's almost a 20% increase in diesel fuel per gallon this May versus the May of 2017. To put this in perspective, it's a little bit of a difference. $3.07 a gallon now is the national average versus $2.56 this time last year, again, for a gallon of diesel.
Now let's look at some of the remarks from Dennis Knowles, their CEO. The prepared remarks mentioned that they made progress across their installation and their pro initiatives, some of which we've talked about in previous podcasts. He was very happy as well with the gross margin and expansion and the improved leverage on the selling, general, and administrative expenses front. Most importantly, though, he mentioned continued positive customer feedback, which is always good to hear for the company, especially after what they went through with that 60-minute special that Leighton referenced. So again, negatives and some positives. The market hit them pretty hard. They've bounced back, though. They bounced back about 2.3% on Thursday. So again, the market's coming around to the idea that it might not be as bad as it looked initially. Their pro process, what that is, that's designed to be a one-stop shop for contractors or business owners looking to remodel their retail or office spaces. Lumber Liquidators has also been expanding the services they provide. Not only can they now assist with installation in a number of markets, as we talked about in 2017, but their pro teams can work out what may be the best products for a particular use, maybe recommend products, and that also helps out on the retail sales front. Their installation packages are now officially nationwide. The last time we discussed Lumber Liquidators, they were only pushed out to a portion of the country. They also have discounts for bulk orders, as most do for flooring, and in-house financing for purchases that meet a certain threshold amount. Now, the latest period, we saw these traffic declines, and this is worrisome. Leighton mentioned weather. I think it's worrisome no matter the factors. Flooring segments in their major competition were positive for at least part of the fiscal quarter. Major competition, we mean retailers like Home Depot, Lowe's, and other major floorers in the United States. Going forward, we'd like to see them funnel some of the savings seen in SG&A to improve online promotion in particular. Continue to draw contractors away from the big box outlets like Home Depot and Lowe's, where we know the traffic is going up. Even if there's a drawback in terms of margins, long-term business potential, very important here for reputation. And that's a key word, especially what they've been through over the last couple of years. They need that staying power in an industry that's become very, very competitive of late. They spoke of trying out different advertising avenues along with different pricing maneuvers to try and bring people in and hook them, especially contractors. They used the word sophisticated with their approach. You get the sense here when you're on the call, this is still a company trying to find its niche in the industry. Found its niche at one point in time, footing slipped a little bit, and now it's one that's still unsure of its core competencies, aside from still having over 400 different flooring brands and options and really being one of the most robust options in this space. Now, it's okay to be unsure of yourself as a company as long as you have profitability and a consistent mission as far as who you're targeting. But with Lumber Liquidators, you could argue that right now they're struggling to find either one as they try to acquire different customer subsets, and they still are remaining inconsistent with the bottom line, as evidenced by the wider loss than expected this quarter. Aside from what could be considered a diversified focus, management said that they were encouraged by a recent all-hands-on-deck sales meeting. Vendor and store management alike said that they were genuinely impressed by customers' responses in terms of the new product, again, vinyl plank flooring being the main one that was mentioned, as well as the service offerings and the pro offerings, speaking to the culture and enthusiasm here that might be trickling down to the lower level sales staff. And even though everyone seems pleased on the product assortment, they're still looking to have an open dialogue with suppliers in order to get additional sizes, which of course is very important, especially from the contractor front, if not new designs and textures. And for the record, before we get to their share price, they've seen an increased interest in their waterproof category. They've managed to target, using that sophistication we talked about, areas closer to big bodies of water, particularly areas hard hit by those hurricanes last year. A lot of those areas are rebuilding in terms of flooring.
You may not need too much sophistication or data systems to understand that being close to bodies of water or big bodies of water is probably going to include a niche category such as a waterproof category for Lumber Liquidators. They spoke of Southern California being a good prominent market for that particular product. But you mentioned shares, Trent. They were a bit up prior to earnings, relatively speaking, around $24 a share on Monday of this week. Then the results came out and that moved shares down to around $20 a share on Tuesday. Still trading at that mark, which represents a market cap of around $570 million for the company. In September, shares, like I said, had moved closer to $40 a share after an earnings beat and some renewed optimism around the future earnings potential for the company. This after shares traded in the $10 range throughout the worst periods of the formaldehyde-related pullback that the company saw and really led to leaving a lot of Chinese manufacturers and suppliers for their particular products. While there seems to be upside potential for the stock after what is now a 52-week low, like I said, do have some regrets in not selling around the $40 a share in the fall, because if you look at the stock now, it may be a long road ahead to reach that mark yet again. Well, we move on to our second story, and this is going to be a total turnaround from the home improvement industry as we look towards Under Armour, as they had a rough and very public last couple of years. However, their first quarter earnings came in, and after spending what some had argued to be too much on endorsements amid falling sales, the company may be back for a stronger 2018 after all. Under Armour, as we all know, came out swinging as they entered the footwear industry. Their mission from day one has been to take on Nike in dramatic fashion and one day overtake them as the athletic powerhouse in the US. More recently, Under Armour has been making more promises with less than exhilarating quarterly results. Between sporting goods retailers exiting the North American retail landscape and deep discounting thanks to higher than normal inventory levels, Under Armour's Kevin Plank seemed a little bit more humble on his approach to the business over the last couple of quarters, really admitted the fault in a number of ways for their core business, speaking about digital and how maybe they overpaid for some of these acquisitions. Shares last year dropped nearly 50%, and Trent, that was on top of double-digit losses in 2016 that topped almost 30%. Nike's massive presence in the United States is obviously nothing to scoff at, but it was the international segments where Under Armour this quarter looked to gain market share, and we see, despite not having much, if not anything, in common with Lumber Liquidators, their fiscal calendar does run in sync. Therefore, Tuesday's release had to do with their first quarter period ending March 31st. Sales for some retailers after the record-breaking holiday season have been lackluster, but many have been reporting positive comps in areas such as footwear and athletic apparel. Most recently, we discussed Lululemon's success on the backdrop of what Trent had mentioned was an even faster growing athleisure segment. We see double-digit increases throughout the industry there, not just with Lululemon's product assortment. And with that, we open the results portion with a Kevin Plank quote, as he said that their first quarter results demonstrate measured progress against their focus on operational excellence and becoming a better company.
Let's talk overall sales for the company. They were up $70 million over last year's quarter. Interestingly enough, this quarter's revenue also beat analyst expectations by the very same amount, $70 million. North American revenue, though, this is what we led the show with, you'll recall. This was slightly down, making it look more and more like the company is giving up on their once lofty growth goals. Again, this is supposed to be a growth-oriented company 3 to 4 years ago, and now it seems like they've stagnated and have even shrank in North America. But international revenue, like we alluded to, that was up across the board. Overall, international segments were the sole reason top-line revenue came in positive for the quarter. They were up 27%, thanks in large part to Latin America being up 21%. It was up 23% in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And Asia, you look at Asia, 35% increase year over year. Asia, of course, being a strong point for other companies like Skechers and Nike in recent years. Now, if we dig just a little bit deeper into those revenue gains, the company is seemingly making some strides in e-commerce. Revenue to wholesale customers increased just 1% to $779 million. And direct-to-consumer revenue, that was up 17% to $352 million. From that, we see that the direct-to-consumer revenue, what a lot of people will refer to as e-commerce revenue, although in Under Armour it includes their retail stores as well, That now represents 30% of their global revenue in the quarter. Now, this percentage was bound to be higher due to recent store closings, as what we saw with Sports Authority and shrinkage in other areas, other sports outfitters, but they have improved certain aspects of their site. And like their competition, they've looked to get newer products out to their customer quicker. Apparel revenue increased 7%. That made up a majority of overall sales via men's training assortments in particular. Footwear revenue, that was up slightly, 1% to $272 million. Accessories revenue increased 3% to $92 million. That, too, was led by men's trading. Now let's take a look at kind of comparing things based on their prior stated goals, Leighton. And I know apparel was and is always going to be a focal point. However, some of their advertising is centered around other things that maybe aren't focal points for them.
They talked about connected fitness being the next big thing not that long ago. Again, this really plays into their digital foray, but we saw that there really was a ceiling for not only the hardware, but with connected watches and Fitbits, but the software as well, as they paid a pretty penny for a lot of these applications. It just did not bear fruit. You're talking about a company that was really riding the wave of success. Kevin Plank could do no wrong. And they made these multi-million-dollar acquisitions, and they did go wrong. They ended up having to write off a lot of the cost of these expenditures, and you see that Under Armour, again, in our view, came to prominence due to a strong, clean brand appeal. Their foray into footwear has seen some inconsistent designs, some being labeled as too much, as far as being too colorful, too dramatic, trying to compete with Nike a little bit too much, and other basketball shoe designs being the victim of memes, like the first Steph Curry shoe that came out, and it was arguably too plain and too boring for some. Meanwhile, these attempts to garner market share from Adidas and Nike has arguably caused the company to lose focus on what they were doing well to begin with, which was producing quality athletic apparel at a mid-tier price point and building a brand off of that very consistency. And now, thanks to aggressive discounting brought forth by some rather high inventory levels, like I had mentioned at the beginning of the story, retail closures, as Trent had just mentioned, the company is still working to push back some analysts from the outside and some other critics from the idea that there could be a multi-year, multifaceted turnaround instead of just a few quarters from now, with some questioning Under Armour's ability to attain their all-time high market cap of nearly $22 billion in September of 2015. You really have to question the focus of Kevin Plank, even though he's talking about restructuring and turning this company around, really maintaining the focus of what got them here in the first place. You do have to wonder how long exactly it's going to take for Under Armour to make their shareholders happy. As we look towards management's comments from the call, we see how this may shed light on a much-needed restructuring plan. On February 13th of this year, the company had announced a 2018 restructuring plan, which detailed expectations to take on roughly $110 to $130 million in restructuring-related charges. Long-term strategy will be in place for 2018, and this trend consists of 4 main points: product, story, service, and team. And quickly digging into these aspects individually, they have attempted to iron out a clear direction and what management deems as a structure for each integral piece of the strategy, which will help them lead into a more profitable direction.
For instance, like for product, what they're doing is they want to get down to the fundamentals, which, again, more corporate speak here. We're used to hearing this from Under Armour, but ideally this should help them to strengthen the brand, have customers again relate Under Armour to quality. In terms of product innovation, they're looking at development, design, and usage occasion. They want to obsess over every stitch, according to the company. Again, a lot of this, I don't know, it kind of falls hollow with me because they've simply struggled to grow over the last 2 to 3 years and struggled to gain traction despite having contracts with some of the most popular athletes that are out there. They want less total SKUs for certain categories as well. Now, I think this is something that we can certainly get behind. This will allow them to concentrate on the products in theory and hopefully for them ensure the highest quality and design. In terms of that story pillar that Leighton referred to, they're looking to employ more technology and get behind their biggest influencers to display their up-and-coming products. The idea being here to reestablish their brand, have deeper credibility. Athletes and movie stars will be wearing Under Armour gear on social media platforms. A good example of this would be Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, as well as Dennis Smith Jr., just to name a couple. They're relating their service pillar, this fourth pillar, to this new to market efficiency, making sure that they're using all of their data to properly forecast with retailers and setting expectations based on accurate lead times, inventory, and perhaps a bit of overproduction for a premium price point in Under Armour, as well as manufacturing lags. These have all been an issue for the company. It's never good when you have overproduction in one area and manufacturing lags in another, but it's up to them to show that these issues will be ironed out using the proper data points going forward. This is actually something that Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey, our guests on today's show, will discuss, is the fact that manufacturing lags can absolutely kill a product, especially when you have another one, in the case of Under Armour, like Nike or Adidas or Reebok, waiting to take that shelf space. Now, shares of Under Armour were up in the 2 days after Tuesday's release by about 10% overall. Shares had been as low as $12 per share 2 quarters ago, but have since been around $15 to $16. Currently, shares are hovering around the $18 price point. That gives the company a $7.5 billion market cap, sort of a midpoint here for the trailing 52 weeks trading levels. Now, once again, coming up, we'll have a great interview. Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey, the creators of Barefoot Wine and authors of the New York Times bestseller, The Barefoot Spirit, will be joining us. They'll talk about a number of different concepts, not only beverage retail, but also they'll talk about how to get your product, if you're a packaged good manufacturer, in front of customers. We've talked often on the podcast about issues facing the retailer, but what about issues facing the manufacturer of a given product? How do up-and-coming brands and manufacturers get their product on the shelves? What's the process like from start to finish? Our guests today know all about that journey, and they devote a lot of their time now to educating brands and packaged good creators about how to connect with retailers to ensure their product makes it in front of customers. We're very pleased to be joined on the Retail Focus podcast today by Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey. They're the creators of Barefoot Wine, one of the titans, of course, in the wine space, and the authors of The Barefoot Spirit, as well as curators of a Shelf Smart series that discusses issues such as these. Michael, Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us today on the Retail Focus podcast.
Well, Trent, it's really our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
So I want to take us back to 1986. You launched the Barefoot brand. You start from basically zero sales. Now, it's a fairly ubiquitous symbol. Everyone knows about the Barefoot brand that's ever gone through a wine section in a store. But before that had to happen, or before that took place, you had to find a way to get from those 0 cases sold to all of those cases sold you got to later on. How did you go about initiating the dialogue, initiating this process to be able to get the product in front of customers at retail stores?
Well, this is the tough one. It's a very competitive marketplace as it is. And in beverage alcohol, it's a very controlled market. So we've faced a lot of challenges. What we did because we were broke. We weren't smart. If we were, we would have done it deliberately, but we kind of fell over backwards and hit the bullseye by accident. And here's what that was. We started small. We made our mistakes in a small place. So we never sold further away from our house than we could drive and apologize and get home in one day. And I'm talking about going out and talking to each individual retailer directly. So at first we only had like 10 or 15 retailers. But because we did, and because we didn't know what we were doing, and because we had a lot of misconceptions that everybody else has, we thought, the retailer's going to take it and everything's going to be fine. And then we found out, oh no, they put the potato chips in front of it. Oh no, it's still in the back room. It never made it to the shelf. Oh no, they put the wrong price on it and that's why it isn't selling. So we learned all these oh no's in probably the first 6 or 8 months. And we said, wow, we're really glad we started small, because if we'd gone big right off the bat, like say statewide or even citywide, we would have these problems all over the place. And we wouldn't have known about them or known how to fix them. So that's how we got started. We got started small.
Another thing I'd like to add to that is it's easier to get your product into a retail store than it is to keep it on the shelf. So many people think that it's really important, and they're going to start smoking cigars and think that they're really have got it made and they've succeeded. if they get some retailers or a big chain to put their product in there. But really, that's where their trouble begins, because you can't be discontinued from that big chain until you're in there in the first place. And it's real easy to be discontinued. Constant vigilance is what it takes. You've got to watch the shelf. It's not enough to rely on your distributors and retailers.
You guys kind of alluded to it in your answers there, but I think from the outside looking in, just from a consumer's perspective, it seems like, nothing goes into the process, basically. They show up in the store and there's a bag of potato chips or a bottle of wine on the shelf, and that's that. But specifically from a brand or a manufacturer's standpoint, it really does seem as though the process is shrouded in mystery if you haven't gone through it before. So what are some aspects to the process that when you were getting into this in the 80s that you discovered for the first time, like, hey, we really need to pay attention to this?
Well, I think we suffered from the same misconception that most Americans do. We go into stores every day. The shelves are all fronted out. Everything is priced right. You can see everything. You don't know what goes on behind the shelves. And so what we found out the hard way, and what we try to save people today from finding out the hard way, is exactly what you're talking about, which is what goes on behind the shelf. And what we found out was that the retailer's clerk doesn't necessarily go in the back room, get it out, price it, and put it in the shelf before it runs out and some competition takes your space. You have to remember how precious that retail space is. And then the second thing is maybe your distributor sold the guy in the store too much of one product that wasn't even yours, and now he's going to punish that distributor salesperson by not buying anything that distributor represents, which includes your product. So again, you run out. Every time you run out, you're not scanning. When you don't scan, you're not selling according to the buyer of the retail store. So now you're really in a situation. You thought that you were selling your product to a distributor. You thought you were in the B2B business, but you're not. You're in the B2B2C business. And that's where it all hangs out. Because when you're out of stock, the customer blames your brand. They think that you're undependable. So the other thing we learned was working with distributors. I mean, they don't buy your brand because it's great or it's priced right. They buy your brand because you have already sold it to some supermarket that's in their retail space, and it makes them look more important and more strategically valuable in that territory. So they buy for strategic reasons. And the sales manager at that distribution company, he buys because you have somebody who's going to help him sell it. So even if his salespeople don't make the numbers, your guy will make the numbers for them. I guess the bottom line is the big lesson we learned is if you're producing a product that's going to get sold at retail, you're responsible for every link in the chain.
Another thing that really surprised us is over the years, and it took some time to learn this because every market is different, we discovered 23 ways why our product wouldn't sell, wouldn't scan, that had nothing to do with our quality or our price. Maybe it didn't scan through the back door. Maybe it was never put on the shelf. Maybe it's got the wrong numbers on it. All kinds of reasons why it wouldn't scan, which means that UPC code is read at the cash register, that had nothing to do with what we were producing. Now, as Michael pointed out, the chain buyer only has the computer in front of his face. All he's going to see is what scans. So no matter what the reason, your product doesn't scan, you as the producer are held responsible not only by the buying public that thinks that you're unreliable, but also by the chain buyer who thinks that you're a slow seller.
And as someone that's done ordering for a retail store in the past, I know I've seen my share of those issues cropping up where something may not be on the shelves or might be perceived as a slow seller, but it's one of those 23 things. And I'm wondering, just from your guys' perspective, how do you go about troubleshooting which of those 23 things is to blame and then addressing that with the retailer, with the store, or some other process in the chain?
We had a salesperson in every territory where our product was for sale, and we called them the wine cop. They would work with the distributor to make sure the distributor had the products in the proper balance. We would work with the salespeople to make sure they were calling on the accounts and keeping up with the orders. We would work with the retailers to make sure the product was going through the entire process and getting to the shelf and getting to the end user. And our salespeople, our wine cops, would also be out in the community supporting the community's nonprofits and fundraisers. So we could bring those customers into the stores, make them aware of the product, giving them a social reason to buy our product because we were supporting their causes. In addition to that, we had a checklist that had these 23 ways on it where our product maybe wasn't selling or scanning, and they would go through the checklist and check everything off to make sure that those problems we had on the checklist weren't causing our sales to be reduced. And if there was something new, well, we'd add a 24th item on that checklist.
Now, the wine cop's obviously a very important cog to this overall system, but as you scaled up into the 90s and the early 2000s, were there issues on that front, maybe making sure that the wine cops themselves were overseen in all of these different markets that your product was in?
Well, they were paid on commission, so they had every reason to take care of any concerns that would result in lack of sales.
And the other thing, too, is, these guys are expensive. A lot of people go into business and come up with a great idea, it's going to change the world, it's going to disrupt the system. But if you sit them down and you say, now listen, you really don't want to expand into a new territory unless you can have your own police force in that territory to make sure that things get through the distribution system and to provide the kind of personalized attention that the retailers need, the clerks need, and the salespeople need to move it along. And when you say that to somebody who's in love with their product, they just look at you with little orphan Annie eyes and just say, you got to be kidding me. Why, that's going to be expensive. And
Yep.
it is. So what we say is everybody knows the cost of goods, but not many people appreciate the cost of sales. And the cost of sales is what kills a lot of businesses. They're fine, in the startup phase and even in the build-up phase, but when they build out, that's what gets them. They underestimate the cost of sales, the cost of customer service, the cost of, returning spoils, the cost of mending fences, taking people to lunch, flying to New York, renting cars. All this stuff has to do with the cost of sales.
Just from the outside looking in, this also ties into some other aspects of your company. For example, I remember reading, I think at one point in time, that you had two divisions. It was basically sales and sales support. So everything kind of tied in with the cost of sales there. But you guys also did a great job in terms of vertically integrating. Just how important is it for a manufacturer or for a company that's representing a packaged good to vertically integrate and maybe not farm out those sales services to a third party that doesn't have your best interest at heart?
Well, we like to say you can outsource everything except sales, quality control, and accounting, those three things. Now, sales, you certainly can't outsource sales. You have to have people that are on your payroll that are subsisting on some kind of a profit-sharing basis or some kind of a commission basis or a bonus basis. So they have to have a financial interest in seeing your product succeed in their territory. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that you have to make sure that everybody in your company understands where the money comes from. It comes from sales. I don't care if they're an accountant or a lawyer or if they're a receptionist or an engineer. I don't care, if they're a winemaker or they work in production. It doesn't.
Marketing.
Yeah, marketing. They're all dependent on sales. So they basically work for sales. As we like to say, all companies only have two divisions, whether they realize it or not: sales and sales support. So like Bonnie says, if you're the CEO, the CMO, the CTO, the VP, or even the P, you are working for sales.
Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey, creators of Barefoot Wine and also authors of The Barefoot Spirit, joining us here on the Retail Focus podcast today. Now, Bonnie, you hit on something a little bit earlier that I wanted to delve into. You mentioned not expanding to a market until you were sure that you had someone there to be able to cover and kind of police that market. On that end, how did you, when you were expanding, determine which markets and which areas you were expanding to before others?
Trent, that is an excellent question. And we did not know the answer to that question for some time. And then we found a cost accountant. A cost accountant differs from a regular accountant. Our cost accountant could point out the cost of each of our items and the transportation and tax and all the other cost of sales to get our product to a particular market and the profits that we could make in that market. And he would tell us where we could afford to expand. For instance, New York is one liquor license per retailer. So it's very difficult to sell a couple cases of wine to one retailer when they don't even have in New York City any holding space whatsoever. However, in California, we could sell a truckload or two to a chain store. Very efficient. This is the kind of information that a cost accountant could tell us. So actually, New York was the last place we went into, and California was the first place that we really grew. It's like finding the low-hanging fruit, and that's what a cost accountant did for us and helped us immensely in our growth process.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is you hear all this kind of Silicon Valley talk about burn rate and VCs and scale fast and fail fast. Forget about it. That kind of thinking will kill you with the retail product. You don't want to have so much money that you can go ahead and expand into like 20 or 30 territories simultaneously. And the reason you don't is because some of those territories you're going to be operating at a loss just to maintain that same shelf price throughout a chain, a big chain, say like Kroger's, that's in so many states in the United States. They might have a region that says, well, we want to put your product on sale for $5.99 in 5 states. Well, you find out that one of those states, every time you sell a case, you're losing $10 or $5. You know, you have to do the math and see if it's worthwhile. So actually, there are territories and there was chains that we did not go into until we were strong enough. Now, if you borrow money to do that, you have to give up your equity in your company. And I'm happy to say that when Bonnie and I sold Barefoot, we owned 100% of the equity. We didn't trade equity so we had expansion money. We actually used cash flow to expand, which means we made enough money in one territory to finance the development of a new territory, one at a time.
That's great. And one of the other things that I want to piggyback off of this idea, this difference between a state like New York and a state like California, of course, here we're talking about wine, and the wine, spirits, beer industry in terms of retail sales, completely different animal from most other facets of retail. What other maybe regulatory or other barriers did you have to cross or hurdles did you have to jump in order to ensure that you got pretty decent market saturation as you were growing?
Well, I'd just like to say that there are a lot of parallels between the alcohol beverage industry and other industries with regard to things like weight and trucking and packaging and how many items fit in a carton and how many cartons fit on a pallet. All this stuff is pretty universal. The bridges of America that you see crossing the freeways will break if the trucks have more than 40,000 pounds on them, which is why you see these 18-wheelers that are 40 feet long or 44 feet long. Inside, they have 2 rows of pallets. Each one is 11 pallets long, and on these pallets are as many boxes as they can fit and not break the bridges. That's why you see all these stop for weight tolls and all that along the freeways. So the bottom line here is that understanding how much it's going to cost you to deliver and sell, and what are the interstate commerce rules and regulations regarding your products, such as taxes, such as forms that need to be filled out, or holding spaces, what have you. warehousing, all of that stuff has got to be taken into consideration before you expand. Now, we're living today in a world where people are saying, oh, well, why don't you just sell it on the internet and then you don't have to go through all those third parties? Well, you can, but you're not going to get a purchase order for 1,000 units from one person and pay you $35,000 on the internet. And the other problem with the internet is it becomes a race to the bottom price-wise, and you can't sell on a tactile basis. Whereas in a store, people can trip on your product, notice it, they can notion buy it, and they can compare it to other products physically. So that's why you want to expand into bricks and mortar retail. Just remember, 90% of all the goods that were sold last year happened in bricks and mortar retail. So, the rumors of the demise of bricks and mortar are greatly exaggerated.
So going back to that brick and mortar standpoint, I think when you look at brick and mortar retail, particularly where you guys were operating with Barefoot, you're looking at an area that was, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, a little bit more fractured than it became as liquor laws kind of loosened, more chains were allowed, that type of thing. Just how much did the retail landscape in liquor change from when you started Barefoot in 1986 to 2005?
Well, I think consolidation is the key word here. It's not just in liquor, it's in all products. We saw the consolidation of retailers. We saw a lot of mama papas and independent chains getting gobbled up, by Target and Walmart and all the big box stores. We saw that transition, and that changed things. Then the other thing that changed was we saw the consolidation of distribution. Many products couldn't even get into states because now there was only one distributor or two, where there used to be maybe 50 distributors. So you wound up having very limited access to market. So that tightened up over those years. The other thing that happened, I think, over those years that's very interesting is that the internet blossomed, and we started to see how important social was and how important having a good website was, and what all the implications of the website were. Like, for instance, if you sold your product online for 1 cent less than a retailer could sell it and make his full margin, they wouldn't take it. So price became really important during those 10 years, because the first thing a retailer would do was get out his phone and see if the price you were offering him was a price that he could sell at that was still competitive with what was online. So that also changed.
Now, as we wrap it up here, both of you still immensely busy, maybe not busy specifically with Barefoot, but a number of other things. You've got not only the New York Times bestseller, The Barefoot Spirit, you've got the Shelf Smart series online, you've got a number of other things that you're working on. So what's next for you guys personally, and how are you trying to get more and more of this word out about how manufacturers can get their product into retail stores?
Well, I think The Barefoot Spirit, which was our New York Times bestseller book, is really an excellent overview of the process, the learning process that we had in developing the brand, taking it from 0 sales to one of the fastest growing wine brands in the nation. And we are very excited to tell you that we're putting this into an audiobook. So we're in the process of developing an audiobook for The Barefoot Spirit right now. And that is going to give a lot of information to a lot of people that are interested in getting their own products out there. And it really is a very fun story. It was written by Rick Cushman, an excellent writer. He took our stories over a period of about 6 months and put them into a very entertaining and educational format. So now that it's going to be in an audiobook, it's going to be kind of like Prairie Home Companion style, like old radio show. So I think it's going to be very entertaining and educational, and we're just totally excited about it.
That's fantastic. I'm looking forward to it too. We were talking before we came on. I'm kind of an old-time radio guy, a golden age of radio guy, so I know I will be first in line to listen to that. That is for sure. Well, Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey, creators of Barefoot Wine, authors of The Barefoot Spirit, as well as the curators of the Shelf Smart series that discusses some of these issues about getting packaged goods into stores. thanks so much for joining us today on the Retail Focus podcast.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Trent.
Well, we thank Michael and Bonnie for joining us. And once again, you can check out their book, The Barefoot Spirit, at www.thebarefootspirit.com. You can reach out to them at that address as well. We continue the Retail Focus podcast with some food news. And that music you heard, that's right, that's the old Food Focus music. Here we've got Yum Brands, the powerhouse parent company of KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut. They reported earnings on Wednesday. Like with the other two companies we've covered so far, this was a mixed bag for the legacy brands that they hold. Yum's share price has been up over 30% from a year ago, thanks to a healthy stock market, but also strong comps brought forth by Taco Bell and KFC. Same-store sales came in positive for all of their brands for this first quarter release. KFC was up a respectable 2%. Taco Bell and Pizza Hut each up 1%. Revenue did fall from $1.417 billion to $1.371 billion, but that fall ahead of the fact sheet consensus of $1.01 billion. And you take out the math there, that's an amazing beat on revenue expectations. Again, expectations of a little over $1 billion. They came in at $1.37 billion. And we talked about the positive same-store sales. There were revenue declines. This was partially because of refranchising efforts, which is one of the reasons why their bottom line was fairly successful this quarter. While they take in royalties and potentially some real estate proceeds, they no longer can add franchised unit revenue to some of their quarterly reports, thus the reason for revenue falling. However, revenue didn't fall as much as Wall Street thought it would, and system sales, this for us, Leighton, this is the more important metric for us trying to analyze sales that their brands are bringing in. Those system sales rose 4% for the quarter. That is a very healthy number considering they are not including their Young China operations since that spinoff. This 4% growth was comprised part of same-store sales increases and part of net store increases. 25% by same-store sales, or boosted by same-store sales, that is. 75% boosted by net new stores. They opened a fairly healthy 239 net new units for what amounted to 3% net new unit growth. In Leighton, the big news, profits were up for the company.
Profits were up for the company with net income of $433 million or $1.27 per share in the first quarter, and this matched up from $280 million or 77 cents per share a year prior. For analyst comparison, adjusted earnings per share was also up and beating consensus marks. They brought in non-GAAP earnings per share of 90 cents, which is 22 cents better than what Wall Street had expected. They are changing their accounting method, so what they called core operating income ended up being neutral year over year, but this is not going to be a factor if you look long term. This accounting method, these new accounting structural changes are going to be a little bit less pronounced in the quarters to come as they become standardized. Beyond their accounting practices, the company has been restructuring a number of different things that has resulted in some one-time expenditures, which leads you to understand the major gap between non-GAAP earnings per share and GAAP earnings per share marks. Since the company is in the midst of what we would consider a more mild transformation, some were wondering if they would keep company guidance intact for the full fiscal year. To that, CEO Greg Creed said that they are, and I quote, maintaining all aspects of their full year 2018 guidance and remain confident that this transformation is building a strong foundation for long-term growth and will deliver increased returns for all of their stakeholders. Their transformation and so-called restructuring will be aided by what management said was unmatched franchise operating capability, bold restaurant developments, and unrivaled culture and talent with distinctive branding. The latter has been huge for KFC and Taco Bell. Let's remember the current Chipotle CEO and former Taco Bell CEO, Brian Niccol, and his bold effort in the marketing realm and the creation of a well-respected mobile platform for Taco Bell. Over the last few years, they've really increased their traffic there thanks to limited time offerings and how they've been promoting those very limited time offerings. Pizza Hut, despite newer restaurant developments, is seen more as the stale franchise with regard to their branding and maybe even their leadership. David Gibbs, now president and CFO for Yum, was previously the Pizza Hut CEO since 2015. He's been with Yum, though, since 1989 in various roles for the company. If we compare Domino's success, or even Papa John's for that matter, we could see now that Taco Bell has been losing out on that millennial market share that those franchises have been taking. And a lot of that has to do with the younger talent that Domino's has brought in. And they really understand how people want convenience. They want their products a little bit faster, a little bit quicker, and to have it be a more convenient process to get them. And some may question the relatively long tenure of some of those executives there at Yum and point to those marginal same-store sales gains as to maybe they should get fresh talent in there, which may very well be one of these initiatives that they're talking about in terms of the talent creation. Pizza Hut, despite aggregate same-store sales coming in at just 1%, Trent, saw U.S. comps grow 4%, which is, in our opinion, a win for the segment.
They remain focused on having a hot, fast, and reliable strategy with Pizza Hut. They're going away a little bit from the fancier pizzas that they rolled out a couple of years ago. All of this hot, fast, and reliable strategy includes better digital integration and better advertising. They've worked with delivery drivers to hasten delivery times as well, and obviously this is an area where newer, better technology can help a business. And if you take their goal of being hot, fast, and reliable, boy, it sounds a lot like Little Caesars hot and ready mixed in with Domino's investment in mobile and delivery. But Pizza Hut, either way you slice it, they're lagging. They're lagging both behind Little Caesars and Domino's. It almost sounds as though they're operating in 2016 when Domino's was talking about some of this stuff instead of 2018. But as we always say, better late than never. That said, can't ignore the ground here. They've lost to those competitors, not only those two, but Papa John's, who's had a relatively good last couple of years, even despite some down points here and there. A positive for Pizza Hut is that the market for QSR pizza is still growing, a roughly $36 billion industry in 2017. Whereas just in 2015, it was only a $34 billion industry. That said, management admitted recent gains are not enough. A new strategy of rejuvenation has to take place, and it needs to be consistent in all markets. This is something they've struggled with, as many franchisees don't want to establish new protocols within Pizza Hut, and so they've had a hard time getting all franchisees on board. For example, when they introduced sauce drizzles and the like, some franchisees in the U.S. didn't carry those whatsoever, and it caused some disconnect between your Pizza Hut experience in one city versus a Pizza Hut experience in another city. Comps more or less in line internationally, by the way, with domestic sales gains for Pizza Hut. Let's talk KFC now. They've been doing really well internationally, and before they spun off into Yum China on the old Food Focus podcast, we talked about how well KFC is doing in China, but they've recently stagnated during this latest quarter. Reba McEntire introduced customers to Smoky Mountain Barbecue through a number of different ad campaigns, and they're likely going to be rolling out some newer menu options as well for the summertime, a few LTOs. But again, they relate the kernel marketing to the distinctive branding initiatives, but I think at this point, there's a potential for it to wear off, and especially you run out of products to sell. You've got the Smoky Mountain Barbecue, the Nashville Hot Chicken, as well as a few other varieties, and after a while, you kind of saturate the market with different styles. Other than the new offerings on the call, they didn't really get into any of the other big initiatives to stimulate sales or excite franchisees. And finally, Leighton, we finish up with Taco Bell. Their domestic increases largely a function of more stores here.
They did cite a few sales-inspiring initiatives for the first quarter, though they led into what is in store for Q2 and Q3, though. They did, for the first quarter, have nacho fries for only $1, and they were very bullish on this during the call. They said that they sold more than 53 million orders in the first 5 weeks of rolling this out. They claimed that these fries were actually part of 1 in every 4 customers' orders. As a result of this success, they extended the limited time offering through April, and this seems highly successful, Trent, and perhaps we should discuss why they aren't keeping this for the rest of the year. And this is the argument we had always made, either on this podcast or the defunct Food Focus podcast, and that with limited time offerings, why end something if it's so successful? If these fries, these nacho fries, were so successful, you're taking some time out of your day to mention them on the earnings call. Why not have them if they're profitable, at least? Even if sales wane in the future, they could extract better margins by having built-in efficiencies if it were a permanent fixture on the menu. Anyhow, Taco Bell, like I said, does have some things rolling out for the second and third quarter of this year. Taco Bell has the $1 triple melt burrito and nachos for Q2. Again, just $1. And this is something that they've been very bullish on, is having that value offering, something that's a little bit tasty, but won't really pack a punch in terms of how much you're having to spend at the counter, keeping many menu items still under the $2 price point. We talked about Taco Bell efficiency in previous podcasts, and that is exactly what they are doing with a new Grubhub partnership that they're extending out. Several franchisees have signed up, supposedly, and they are on board to have Grubhub integration on their point-of-sale systems at Taco Bell's and KFC's. This will help streamline the Grubhub ordering system. Obviously, they've had problems with full-service restaurants trying to integrate this. But speaking about efficiency and speaking to customer loyalty increases, if all goes smoothly in practice, you should be pleasing a lot of customers there with that integration. Shares of Yum Brands, ticker YUM, fell over 4% on Wednesday, currently trading for around $82 a share as of recording this podcast on Thursday, still up from the $69 a share levels they had during the first quarter of last year. We wrap up our news portion of the show with CVS, who turns things around by showcasing positive front-of-store sales in their latest quarter. Their earnings, released on Wednesday, just like Yum Brands, are for the first quarter 2018 ending March 31st. As we dig into the numbers, net revenues increased 2.6% to $45.7 billion. Most expected some sort of increase here, driven mostly by a few new locations and increased pharmacy sales, which we've seen thematically throughout the pharmacy industry, or at least the retail pharmacy industry. This was indeed the case, as claims through their pharmacy network increased 6% over last year's first quarter. Overall, sales in the pharmacy services division increased 3.2%. They mentioned brand inflation as a big driver of additional revenue as well. The big news, though, at least for us, is their retail and LTC segment, which makes up less than half of their overall business. So revenues were up a whopping 5.6% versus last year. Same-store prescription volume was up 8.5%, which they credited a variety of things for, including their inclusion of several Medicare Part D networks this year versus last. These are the revenues, but what about those same-store sales, Trent? As this is a company that has been on our news feed for quite some time.
Well, for the first time in several quarters, this is big news here, that front store comps actually increased over last year. This is the main reason we're even talking about them on this show, as we've covered retail pharmacy a lot lately. Don't want people to get burnt out on it. But big news from CVS, and maybe news we should have seen coming, as their fourth quarter front store comps were only down 0.7% year over year. Now, granted, that number inflated a little bit by a larger than normal cold and flu season. This is the first time their front store comps have increased since the first quarter of 2016, when they went up 0.7%. That's a whole 2 years ago, and prior to that, you have to go back to the first quarter of 2013. That's back before they stopped selling tobacco, to put it in perspective, for another positive comp quarter. Thanks, by the way, go to listener Peter V.S. Bond, who hooked us up with a handy chart with front store sales information for both CVS and Walgreens dating back to 2012. That same chart tells us that Walgreens hasn't had a positive quarter for front store sales comps since the third quarter of 2015, and lately, for Walgreens at least, it's been getting worse while it's getting better for CVS. CVS front of store sales this quarter went up by 1.6%. Now, the company did admit that some of the sales impact was due to the Easter shift, as the holiday was moved into the first quarter this year versus the second quarter last year. However, even without this, based on the information the company gave during the earnings call, they would have still been in the positive without the Easter shift. Once again, this is thanks to cold and flu season, which added 70 favorable basis points to that number. Now, not all was super positive in this category. They did mention softer front store traffic year over year. However, the people coming in are, for whatever reason or another, spending more money. And this softer traffic comes, by the way, even with Easter in tow, no less. When taken as a whole, their same-store sales, including both the front store and the pharmacy, increased a whopping 5.8%. Pharmacy alone was a positive 7.3%. And this is despite a 280 basis point negative impact thanks to the introduction of key generics in the last year. Their pharmacy sales continue to be robust in the face of this, and the company alluded to the fact that there are many in-store pharmacy initiatives not only boosting pharmacy sales, but also front store sales as well.
Some other quick news from the call. They did mention that their shareholders have approved the transaction with Aetna, as they are in the process with responding to the Department of Justice's second information request issue back from February 1st. They maintain that the deal is set to be closed in the second half of 2018. And just for those who are unaware of how big Aetna is, They are extremely large. They have over 23 million people as medical members, 14.3 million, and this is as of 2016, as dental members, and 15.3 as pharmacy benefit management services members. So this is a massive powerhouse, and we talk about synergies all the time and how that word gets floated about through analysts, and maybe it doesn't have bearing here, but I think as far as how this relates to their pharmacy business, I think it's going to be massive for the company. They mentioned that the revenues from the pharmacy benefits management division were up 3.2%, and that renewals for 2019 are in line with last year. These numbers are only going to be aided if this acquisition with Aetna comes true. Finally, they added 44 net new locations and relocated 5 stores, continuing their process of growing steadily throughout the United States. They now have over 9,847 retail locations. Amazingly, 49 of those just don't have pharmacies. So this includes nearly 1,700 pharmacies in Target locations. We had mentioned that a year and a half ago or so once that transaction had finalized. We mentioned that this is a company that is up against fierce competition from Walgreens, but if you look at Walgreens and what they have to offer in terms of the retail competition, there really isn't much in terms of comparison here. CVS is hitting on all cylinders, and this is certainly a company to watch over the next year or so as they come up against, again, the Department of Justice and other regulators, maybe really putting up their hands here as far as trying to push back this Aetna acquisition.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
Well, we've reached the final segment of the Retail Focus podcast, a segment where we look ahead at maybe a news story that'll be breaking over the next week or the next month or perhaps the next year, and we begin with Leighton.
Last week, we talked about Hasbro and the toy industry not doing that well overall, as revenue for the company in their first quarter fell 15% year over year, and analysts were expecting a big decline, but Trent, ended up being a bigger decline than what they were expecting, and overall, you see a company really a lot of question marks surrounding Hasbro and their leadership team. But one of the things, or two of the things that we had mentioned on last week's podcast, was how they're going to succeed in the rest of 2018. There was two main facets to their sort of mid-tier turnaround strategy. One was going to be product innovation, and one was going to be strong licensing through the brands for which they already have relationships. We talked about Star Wars, and we talked about Marvel as being two of those relationships. But now you could go ahead and increase that to a third potential long-lasting initiative, as Hasbro is buying the Power Rangers toys brand from Saban Properties in a cash and stock deal valued over $500 million. And if you look at those numbers, Trent, that they ticked in for their quarter, all of that money lost, well, apparently they still have a lot of cash on the balance sheet. And that's what a lot of people were talking about when they were trying to criticize the company, was that, well, at the end of the day, they still do have cash to have some lasting power in the toy industry. But now you really have to question how much cash they're going to have on that balance sheet after this acquisition. But you look, it's not just going to be Power Rangers, Trent. It's going to be a lot of other things included from this Saban Brands acquisition. You're looking at Julius Jr., Luna Petunia, Treehouse Detectives, and other brands for which I'm not that aware of since I don't have children. But overall, this acquisition is expected to close in the second quarter of this year. So perhaps, Trent, this was already something in the works for months now, something up their sleeve to really propel them into the third and fourth quarter of 2018.
What I'm looking ahead towards is actually a Canadian company that's expanding in the U.S., this via Chain Store agent Marianne Wilson, as she reports that Roots, the Canadian clothing manufacturer and retailer, will open 2 stores in the greater Washington, D.C. area coming up in August of this year. And in fact, she quotes Jim Gable, the president and CEO of Roots, is saying that they're looking to open another 10 to 14 new U.S. retail locations by the end of 2019. Now, I'm a little bit familiar with the company Roots simply because I've worked with a lot of Canadians in the past. I know Roots is a company that you see a lot of, not only in Canada, but also through mail order supplies. But I just wonder how much their message, how much their overall brand is going to resonate with consumers in the U.S. So far, they must like their stores that they've got in the U.S. They only have 3 in the United States. So they're looking to more than quadruple the number of stores they have in the U.S. over the next few years. So Leighton and I will both keep an eye on this and their smaller square footprint, as they like to be in areas around 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, and see if they can manage their way towards success in the U.S., particularly in larger metro areas. Well, that'll do it for us here on the Retail Focus. For Leighton, I'm Trent. A big thanks once again to our guests, Michael Houlihan and Bonnie Harvey, creators of Barefoot Wine and authors of The Barefoot Spirit. You can check that out at www.thebarefootspirit.com, and you can check out that audiobook, as they mentioned that they've talked about releasing as well. Until next week, this has been the Retail Focus. So long.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.